is fine. All right. So hi and welcome. I am Jennifer Soames, and I'm here today with my lovely friend Kim Peterson. And she and I are here today to have just an organic conversation on race and racism and relationship, and just talking a little bit about some of our own interactions, particularly in the last month and a half. And some of the conversations that we've had, we decided to bring them online and to just share openly, because other people may be having some of the same either questions or challenges as they go to talk with people that they know about race and racism, and how that affects relationships, and how do we have these conversations that can sometimes, and really most of the time, are uncomfortable and difficult. So I am not an expert on this topic whatsoever. I am simply a human being who is in the process of learning and growing so that I can be better and do better, and be a part of solutions rather than problems. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to Kim Peterson, who I've known for I think about 5 years or thereabouts, and we both share a passion for seeking truth and telling our truth, and I've learned a lot from Kim and how I show up and how to be our authentic selves. So she's been an inspiration to me over these past 5 years, personally and professionally, and so I'm honored to have you here today, Kim. And first off, thank you for, one, even having these conversations with me, and secondly, for being here today.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm really happy to be here, and I know that you and I connected earlier to understand really what your hope was and what your purpose was, so I certainly feel like this is going to be a productive conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah. So do you want to share, or I can, either way, we can both chip in, about kind of how this all started about 6-ish weeks ago?
Sure. Why don't you share from your point of view, and that would probably lead into how this conversation came to.
Yeah, I think that's great. So it was shortly, maybe a couple weeks after the death of George Floyd, and that was really when the protests were really kind of on the forefront of everybody's mind and the news. And you had a wonderful panel discussion on race and racism that I attended, and that was wonderful. And I think it was right after that I had messaged you to say, after hearing you mention in that panel how meaningful it had been for particularly your brother to reach out to you and ask you how you had been doing. And I had messaged you to say that, well, I hadn't reached out in the last week because I basically didn't want to be a burden, and because you or any Black or person of color didn't owe me any kind of explanation or really any time to talk about it. So I thought that, but I basically wanted to say, like, oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to have the panel discussion and how much I learned. But I had thought that I was doing something respectful, basically, by not reaching out. So I thought that I was like doing the right thing by kind of not saying anything to you particularly. And that was a mistake that I found out later in our discussions, and it had been based on kind of the overall messaging that I was seeing, particularly on social media, about, like, basically the message I got was kind of like, leave your Black friends alone right now, because don't overwhelm and burden them, because there's so much going on right now. That was kind of the, at least, subliminal messaging that I had received. So I thought that I was doing the right thing. And I'll share a little bit later that there's actually one of the emails I got, it was on, I think, June 25th. I get Nicole Cardoza's Anti-Racism Daily emails. And she's a Black woman who provides these emails every day, and with some really great information. But there's actually an email that kind of talks a lot about this conversation that we've had and that we're having. And I may share just a little snippet of that too, just to show one other person's perspective on it too. So
Sure.
that's kind of how we led up, and we had a conversation about how that impacted you and what your needs actually were and are. And we kind of just proceeded from there.
Right, and I appreciated Jennifer's reaching out, and I remember having to ask her, or staying curious about asking her, why you were apologizing, right? And then because, like Jennifer said, she's a woman who seeks after truth and authenticity. We were able to have an open conversation, and had you not been on that call, the panel discussion where even my brother was there, which he surprised me that he was on that call, I might not have said that, how meaningful it was that he reached out to me, and you might not have seen sort of that emotion, because I was definitely very tender about that. Just a little bit of backstory. I was adopted into a white family when I was an infant, and so I have several siblings by adoption who are white, and an extended family that's white as well. And yeah, it was super meaningful, because here we are on July 17th, and there's no shame about this, but it's just the reality that of all of my siblings and extended family who are white, only 2 actually have even spoke about this to me.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think that, I can't speak for why that is with them, except for everybody has their own experiences. But my brother, who is white, reached out to me on a Facebook post. I had just wrote something very simple after George's murder.
Mm-hmm.
It was a dragonfly, and it said, "Kindness changes everything." And I just said, "I'm incredulous." And I went, I was really tired, and I went to bed. Well, the next day he had written on this post, I am I'm a white man, and I have no idea what you must be experiencing as a Black woman right now. And I just wanted you to know I was thinking of you, or something to that degree. And it just literally took my breath away. One, that he would acknowledge he's white, I'm Black, there's something going on here. I don't understand how you could feel at all, how this could be impacting you. But basically, I'm acknowledging that. And I couldn't even answer it, Jennifer. I couldn't respond because it brought so much emotion to me. I couldn't respond for a couple of days. And then he showed up on this panel, and yes, it was highly impactful. I think one thing I would say with regards to our conversation and to what the impetus for this whole communication is right now is, everybody is experiencing this in different ways. Now we have the Black collective and our experience, and then there's the white collective and how they're feeling and such. And I think you're right. There was a lot of messaging, even from what I was reading, whether it's blogs or hearing, to, hey, leave your Black friends alone, like you said, do your own research and those sorts of things. And there's some good validity in those points. But for me, it's very meaningful. And so for to be in a situation where everybody knows what's going on, and not being sort of acknowledged, feels exclusive. Again, it actually feels like what happens to Black people and people of color and people who are marginalized for many different reasons. So it was hard.
Sure. And one of the many lessons that I have learned out of all of our interactions in these last 6 weeks has been, one, how, I mean, no one speaks for everybody, right? And the importance of cultivating those individual relationships that we have with people, and to really recognize and maybe even to ask, like, what do you need? Or would it have even been helpful if, for instance, I had reached out and said, I don't even know what to say right now, but I'm thinking of you, or something to that effect? Because sometimes I think, at least I know for myself, it's like I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Because of like I didn't want to offend or say the wrong thing. So I think there was that kind of level of fear of saying the wrong thing that just led me to say nothing. And I think that
Sure.
even throughout history has been one of humanity's biggest downfalls when it comes to any kind of social injustice, is that silence is what hurts, I think, sometimes more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. You are absolutely right. And you know, because as you mentioned when you opened, you said something, let me try and recall what you said specifically, but just this is always a tough conversation, or it's just never easy. But you know what I've realized to be true, Jennifer, is the more I have these conversations, the less tough it becomes. You know, from my perspective.
Yeah.
Because if we stop and think about it in the first place, why do we make it so difficult? Like, really, like, unpack it. What makes it so difficult?
That's a great question.
Yeah. For instance, you said, she's like, that's a great question. For instance, you said, well, I was afraid I'd say the wrong thing. Well, what if we were able to remove that fear just by way of having shared values of authentic relating, or shared values of kindness and compassion, right? Compassion is seeing a need and acting on it. So where is room for you or me for fear if we at the core level have shared values? And we do, in this regard at least. And you and I both, what I know to be true is you and I both value authenticity, right? But yet still there's that fear there. So where does that come from? And where are we getting those stories and those narratives? But it doesn't have to be hard anymore. I remember I was interviewed about this topic before George's murder on a podcast, and I was afraid. I said, okay, I'll have the conversation, but let's call it bias. Let's not say racism. You know, and there was a lot of angst around it. And so I had to challenge my own self and my own belief system around that as well. But yes, I'm glad that you reached out and we were able to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, and part of this process for me, and I think particularly for fellow white people who might watch this, is to own up to those mistakes, right? Because it can be really uncomfortable to ourselves. And I've admitted to you and other people who know me know that I'm a recovering perfectionist. So making mistakes makes me really uncomfortable, although I've definitely gotten a lot more comfortable with that. But especially when it comes to interpersonal relationships, like that's where I have probably the greatest fear around making those mistakes, because I don't want to be rejected or thought negatively or about. So, but at the same time, like the way that we get better at anything is by making mistakes.
Right.
And that's the only way that we as humans tend to learn the best, is by making mistakes and not getting things right, especially the first time.
Right. And you know, one thing I want to say about that is, right, so communication is a two-way street. So if you were to reach out to me and I had some energy around it, you know, well, why haven't you reached out, or fill in the blank, that also just shows me that I still have some work to do, right? Because yes, I would love for that connection, and I have gotten quite a bit of that connection, and thank you for yours. But yes, I want that. But if that's my energy around it, it's showing me that I still have some work to do myself. And so depending on how I respond to you can impact your perception of you getting it right or wrong. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes a really good point too. Yeah, really good point, right? Because it's not one-sided. It's definitely a two-way street. And
Right.
and I think it's important for everybody to know that, like, if somebody reaches out to you and you're not in the frame of mind to have that conversation or to respond back, like, it's okay to say so. And I think, I mean, no one has the obligation to respond back to anybody, especially if it doesn't feel supportive. But to maybe just say, like, got your message, not right now, or something to that effect, right? Because no one has any obligation to, especially I think Black and people of color right now have really no obligation to respond to any kind of message that they receive that isn't supportive right now. But that's everybody's individual choice on how to respond or to not respond at all. So
Yes, but that's such a good point that you bring up. And I have learned to respond better. And here's how. So, for instance, I remember when you reached out to me about this conversation, even I said, great, let's have a conversation about it, but it's probably going to be about 2 weeks out. Not because I was super busy, but because I didn't have the emotional capacity, right? Because I was still walking through and processing and grieving through on my own levels. And your response was great, you know, no problem, take your time, whenever. And so I want to point out to whoever might be listening is that that is such a beautiful, symbiotic, synergistic, you know, relationship of communication where I feel free to, well, where you feel free to ask for what you need or want, which is a conversation. I feel free to say, yes, let's schedule this out a couple weeks. And then even when those couple of weeks came up, I was still taxed. And Jennifer said, no problem, let's reschedule again. So that's a beautiful example. And I was able to ask for what I needed. Where I learned this and how I learned this is because when so many texts were coming in towards the beginning, it was so overwhelming to me. Just, you know, what do you know, just so emotionally overwhelming that I didn't even have the energy to say, great, thanks, let me get back to you. So, you know, I actually ended up, I think, hurting somebody's feelings because I probably let a week go by before saying, hey, yes, I'm happy to chat and thanks, just not right now. And so I had to learn. And one bit of advice I had was, you know, have a canned short response to let people know that you got their text and move on. But that's how emotionally involved, for me at least, and everyone's going to walk through it on different levels, that's how much emotional involvement it took for me, where
right.
I just didn't have the energy to say, hey, thanks for the text.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's great. And, you know, all of this is brought up. I mean, there's been so much trauma in the last 4 or 5 months anyway, just as we go through a pandemic and things were already really pretty charged for people because of isolation and, you know, our lives being kind of turned upside down for the most part. And then you add on even more murders of Black people by police officers and just a lot of the again, greater division amongst people in our country. And so, like, everything was just so charged that it brings up so much trauma for a lot of people on different levels. And we have to recognize that even though that's not our experience, or maybe it's not, but we have to give people space to respond when they're able. And it's not reflecting back on us. So for us to also not take it personally, because people need to process and take the time that they need before they can respond, rather than to react, because when we kind of pressure people into getting a response, or when we feel like we're obligated to give a response, then it tends to be more of a reaction as opposed to an actual response. And there's a difference between those two things. So giving people that space and just being like, oh, they haven't responded back to me yet. Like, oh, well, maybe check back in with them in a week and just be like, hey, by chance did you get my text? But to allow people to take as much time as they need at the same, even if it's not what we would think is what we would need.
Right. I want to add to what you were saying about trauma, and it's compounded trauma. And so that's one of the things I wasn't expecting was, for me, I was incredulous to what my eyes were seeing with George and his murder. And then I was sort of, on the panel holding this space for all of us. And then I was holding space for the Black community and thinking about other experiences outside of myself. But then I unexpectedly found that I was getting triggered back to my own experiences that, for the most part, I have resolved, but I had one as early as last August, which was pretty intense. And so what I realized is some of those feelings were coming up, or I was getting triggered from it. So the point I want to make that comes from what you said is it's compounded trauma. And the more layers of trauma an individual has, the more time probably it's going to take them to be able to have that resilience and the ability to come back and bounce back. So to further that, I thought about, I'm not a Black man in America either. And darker Black men are probably going to get profiled even more so than lighter Black men. Right. Now imagine if you have a family and your family is Black, and somebody generationally, someone, your sibling was murdered or attacked unjustly by a cop. And then what if in your mom's generation, something happened there? And then you get to the grandparents and something happened there, maybe even a lynching, and then the great grandparents. So that's so many layers of compounded trauma, and that's just one topic within what's possible.
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And there is all of that generational trauma that is really coming to light right now, but it's been there the whole time.
Right.
And even if people haven't had a term for it, but people have known it's there. And I agree that the more compounded trauma that people have, likely the more time that people need to process that.
Right.
Yep. One thing I wanted to bring up was on the topic of recognizing the impact that our actions have as opposed to the intention behind them. I've seen this come up a few times in regards to discussions on race, but particularly when I was reading White Fragility, it was brought up, and she did a really good job talking about it. But, basically, like let's say that I did apologize for not reaching out because I was in the wrong in regards to what you needed. And so much, especially as a yoga teacher, we talked so much.
May I interrupt for
Absolutely,
one moment?
go for it.
Just because you said because I was in the wrong, because I didn't know what you needed, I would encourage you to reframe that. It's not like you're wrong, right? I'm not wrong. I wasn't as aware, or maybe I wasn't as aware of how great the need would be. And I didn't face my fear to just walk through it anyway. Those things don't make you wrong. And the words that we say about ourselves are so important, right? That's where those self-limiting beliefs come, or those false narratives come. And especially as a recovering perfectionist, you and me, we we don't need that. So it's actually really important. I wanted to say, let's reframe that.
Thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate that. Yeah.
sure.
Get my brain back here. But in regards to recognizing the difference between impact and intention, because so often when we maybe aren't aware of how our actions impact somebody, well, and then we find out that it had some hurtful responses. I mean, right, somebody was hurt because of something that we did or didn't do or said or didn't say. We'll often say, oh, well, that wasn't my intention, or I didn't mean it that way, or basically some I would say excuse like that, meaning that, oh, I didn't mean it, so therefore it shouldn't have an impact. But the analogy that I read in White Fragility that I thought was impactful was that something to the effect of, if you accidentally punch somebody in the face, well, that person still feels the pain, right? So it doesn't matter if the intention was there or not. I think it hurts worse if the intention was there. But even in something that's accidental or just out of unawareness, really, we have to recognize the impact that we can have on somebody, and to recognize that and to become aware of it, so that we go, oh, I didn't mean that, but I see how that impacted you. And, apologize when that's, indicated. But I think that was an important point, because so often when we talking about racism in particular, so many excuses go back to, well, I didn't mean it. And that doesn't matter when it still had the impact. So if there's anything that you want to add to that, it was just something that I thought was important to bring up.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I really appreciate that example because it's pretty clear. When I was younger, I remember in college, people would say to me, "Oh, well, I don't think of you as Black." I mean, look at your face. You're like, no. I mean, I remember vividly, and I actually remember the person who said this, but I've heard it many times. Oh, I don't even think of you as Black, and you are so articulate. Right? Yeah.
Wow.
This is reality. This is reality. So things like that, which also when people say things like that, or I don't see color, it denies your reality.
Right.
I am Black, and so what are you really trying to say? Now, this is perfect because you said, in whether or not you intended it, right? Maybe you didn't intend it that way, but guess what? This is what's so great about all these things. Then we get to go back and be students of ourselves and hone our self-awareness to learn better, to do better. But yes, I think that's a great example.
Yeah, thank you. And man, yeah, the whole I don't see color thing is a whole nother topic. But yeah, and I think another thing that I have been learning, and especially through our conversations, is the ability to accept feedback and openly, right? So especially not getting defensive, especially if we do make a misstep and we get feedback, right? If I, in the future, perhaps, because I am bound to make other missteps, and to just maybe not have awareness because I'm in the process of learning like everybody else, but if I said something that maybe offended you, or that maybe just wasn't true, and you took that as a learning opportunity for me, it's so important for me to just go, just as you did earlier about the way that I phrased talking about mistakes. It's like, just say, thank you, and to just accept and just to take it in and to work with that, but to avoid getting defensive on anything, because you know what, like, I don't know everything.
I don't know everything.
And nor do you, right? But we can learn from each other, and that's the beauty of these relationships. But it's being willing to accept feedback and graciously, but also to give feedback graciously too, because especially when talking about race, and particularly when in regards to white people who far too late, but here nonetheless are waking up to some of the realities that have been and that are, we also have to meet people where they are. And so not everybody knows it all yet. And so people of, I mean, everybody, we have to give ourselves a little and each other a little bit of grace as we grow. But as you and I talked about, is when it is genuine, right? When the desire to do better, to grow, to learn is genuine. And I think that's where we do put the energy and the grace. But if it's not genuine, I don't know that it's worth our time and our energy and that. But when we see it and people are open to it, then that's where we start to make even those little shifts that are so needed. Even just measured in micrometers, it's like, for some people that's huge. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, sincerity goes a long way. We had talked just for a moment on, you know, now is a great opportunity, and I appreciate you having this conversation. And again, I was discerning for, you know, the sincerity in it, because this can be a time where people become performative. That could look like a variety of things, but this is where I can, you know, be a great activist or advocate, and really not wholeheartedly and sincerely be in alignment with that. And, you know, I think, you know, who knows, perhaps that's where some of the angst or the pushback might come from, you know. But sincerity goes a long way. And the thing is guess what? I think of this because, you know, last year and for years, the Jewish community, you know, where people were bombing and, you know, churches and killing Jews and Latinos as well. Now this isn't these aren't my communities, but I absolutely, when these things were happening, had reached out to my friends and colleagues who are Jewish and Latino and just left a message or called them and just said, I just want to acknowledge what's going on in the news, and just want to acknowledge you. That's as easy.
Yeah.
You know, and I didn't expect them to have anything back to say to me, but that's just what we can do in authenticity and in humanity. Is, are we aware? And what would you say to anyone, right? What would you say to your white friend? What would you say to, you know, if you saw someone on the street? Which is another thing that I have thought about deeply, is this gives us each an opportunity to even go beyond thinking about our bias and our prejudices and are we racist, our narratives. And it really gives us the opportunity, Jennifer, to go to the essence of who we are as individuals in terms of character and in terms of values. When your values are clear, your decisions are easy, right? And so I do think that it's a great opportunity, because do we really have kindness and care and compassion for individuals? And if we do, how does that show up? Because we act out of our belief system, right?
Right. And I think you said this on the panel too, something to the effect of just the topic of seeing people, right? And I love that you acknowledged to your Jewish and Latino friends when they were experiencing traumas and murders and other, you know, social injustices, that you just recognize them. And I think just recognizing people, seeing people for who they are, and right, because like if I didn't see you as a Black woman, like we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I see you for who you are, and the impact that things happening in our country, in our world, are having on you personally, as both a human being, but also particularly as a Black woman. Like, you can't separate those two, because you have that unique experience of being a Black woman in this world that I don't have. But if I didn't acknowledge it, then I wouldn't be seeing you for who you are either.
Right. I want to add to that, because I think that this is so important, because if you don't acknowledge that, if you don't see that, imagine, right? And this is where I've had to do my own inner game and healing work around this, even during this time, is imagine then what it feels like say if you and I had gone all this time and there really wasn't an acknowledgement of some sort. Who knows? I know I would be aware of it, right? Because I am a Black woman, this is a time that we are experiencing, and nationally and globally, everybody collectively is paying attention. So how do I, as a Black woman, reconcile that? That's been difficult. And I'll tell you a little bit of example around that, but it's been difficult because, say I have colleagues that I've had for, you know, just a long tenure. Say I have friends for 20 years or 15 years, and we laugh or we have fun or we go deep into things. But this is the most deepest reality that's talking about our identity and our essence. And if you haven't heard at all, even an acknowledgement, whether it's, I'm talking even less acknowledgement than a text. Maybe it's a social smiley face, an emoji, maybe it's a whatever. But if you don't have that, at least for me, it's like, how do I reconcile that? Do you see me as a Black woman? Do you, what's happening here? And so that was part of my trigger. And so what I had to do is also look into my own heart and decipher a few things. And one thing is everybody's going to respond differently. This person over here might have a bunch of fear, let's say, that like somewhat like what you were experiencing or you talked about. Doesn't make them wrong. How I choose to respond to that, right? Am I bitter? Do I just give a cold shoulder? You know, so I realized I had some forgiveness work in some areas and some release work that I needed to do. And I just consciously need to allow people, honestly, to be who they are, be who you are, but also I recognize, okay, what, you know, how that sort of defines the nature of the relationship. Make sense?
Absolutely.
And you can have that definition of the relationship without having a bunch of bitterness. But I think it's quite something to reconcile if you've had, you know, considerable relationship.
For sure.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to make sure to say that I have thought a lot about is, you know, I could hold a grudge, you could hold a grudge. I could need to be right, you could need to be right. You could be afraid of Black people. I could hold, you know, all of white people, you know, accountable. You know, all of this stuff, the way that we choose to respond is going to come out of our own levels of personal healing is really what I'm saying. Right?
Yeah.
And it just, this is such a valid time for discovering and such, but it's also such a time to get a reflection of where we are individually and the kind of work that we still need to do in order to move forward. I want to share with you a quick example of a client of mine, and he's an attorney, and he told me the story. I'm going to break down so quickly. And he said, Kim, this was way back when we were teens, you know, on the East Coast. They would go to the summer camp, and it's usually middle class, you know, white kids there. And there was this one black guy. So he became really good friends with this black guy, who then the next year they went back to camp, and he was the lifeguard. And my client was taking a swim test and was deathly afraid of these huge fish that were in the water. And it was just horrifying to him. And he was already having a panic, you know, around that. Well, anyway, one of them graced up against his body, and he freaked out. He freaked out and forgot about the swim test and started going toward the lifeguard in the rowboat. Swimming, and just, you know, just panicking. Get me up here, get me up here. And the guy was responding and all this chaos. And in the midst of all of that, he says to his black friend, you know, UN, get out of the way. I need to get in this boat. Yeah, this is like 50 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. That's how he was internally, you know, off kilter. Well, anyway, when all of this has been going on, and he, you know, was a part of the protests and, you know, just getting woke himself, he thought, I need to reach out to this guy. So he reached out and he found him on LinkedIn, and he called him and he said, you know, I don't know if you remember me. And he said, I do. And, you know, they talked a little bit about camp, and he said, I'm calling you for a specific reason. I want to apologize for, and then he told him that story. Now, there are so many things that we can learn and understand from this, but one of them is this man didn't even remember. He didn't remember it at all. My client said, Kim, of all the bad choices I've made in my entire life, this was the most shameful and the one that I've held the most regret over for over 50 years. He held it.
Wow.
This is the importance of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And doing our forgiveness work,
Right.
that when he told him, he said he was so much lighter, and he said, I'm just like a different person. And even though this man didn't remember it, he was so grateful, and it was so healing, because those words that say, you know, I'm sorry, or I was wrong, or will you forgive me, they go so far. And so when we talk about communication as we are and relationship as we are, and thinking about the bigger picture, imagine what it would be like if those two in authentic, sincere communication had this new understanding of deep, deep healing and release. And these two then were able to go to the boardroom to restructure policy with an understanding that was based in humility and understanding and absence of fear and pride. You need to be right, whoever, and whatnot. Make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's just really been a lot on my mind in that way. And it's challenged me to look at, you know, my own biases, right? And my own responses, and again, my own work that I may still need to do. And I just think it's a hard time, and there are some beautiful silver linings as well.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And yeah, I've had to definitely do a lot of my own work too. And I've been honestly surprised at how much I have learned in the process, because I didn't think I had as much to learn as I do. And that's been humbling, but also just really good, because I am learning, and it's something that I love to do anyway. I love to learn, but especially for the sake of social justice. And so it's been really eye-opening, and it will continue to be. And, you know, part of me is sad that it has taken till now. And at the same time, I'm also grateful that there's this opportunity to have this in the spotlight, to do this work. because it is so needed. It's long overdue. I mean, 400 some odd years overdue. But I'm so grateful that I get to have these conversations. And yes, you're so right that the more that we talk about race and racism and everything that goes with that, it does get easier. And it's just like walking. Like, we started walking or riding a bike, and it was hard. We fell over, and all the time, and yet we become more proficient at it, and we grow and we learn. And I think that's the most important thing that I can encourage anybody to do, is to do your own work. Because whether you're protesting or not, or doing things, trying to be a part of different groups, it doesn't matter if you aren't doing your own work. If you haven't done your own work, all of that's for naught. That's my personal opinion. But if you're not looking at yourself first, then anything else that you do is not going to be effective.
Yes, that reminds me of one of the panelists, J.R. Nobles, who said that, and was very educational for me, and that he said what you said, basically. Step one, do your own work, challenge your own narratives, what stories, what biases, how come you think that way, what do you do, how do you respond? And by the way, he said you could be in step one for a very long time.
Right.
But do step one before you move on. And so I thank you for being such a student, and just your courage as well, because it does take courage, and it takes time, and it takes energy and emotion. And so I really thank you, and I hope that you continue, you personally, to have these conversations, because it's going to be important to continue to have them, and maybe have different, bring to light different angles or whatnot. But if you can continue those conversations, I think that's going to be very, very impactful.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, I so appreciate your willingness to have these conversations as well, because, what we, as you said, we as white people keep being told is that, Black people and people of color don't owe us any kind of explanation. They don't owe us any kind of unpaid training or education. And so I really, really appreciate you and your willingness to have these conversations, because you don't owe me anything in regards to this. And yet, this deepens, I think, our own relationship between the two of us, and hopefully other people will glean from this as well. And just the importance of our own relationships, and seeing people for who they are, our own unique identities and experiences that come with those identities. And they are so multi-layered and faceted, and they run deep, and there's so much more than the color of our skin, our gender, any of that. And so to really see people in their entirety and what they bring to the table is going to help us in our own relationships, personally, professionally, moving forward politically, and as a country. So, but we have to start by holding up that mirror to ourselves, and you're right, getting over that fear of, oh, am I going to say something wrong? Because, if you do, accept feedback, apologize when you need to, and move forward, right, by continuing to learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything else that I missed, or anything else that you want to add? Any kind of last burning things that you feel need to be said?
No, I think we really covered it. I think we really covered it. Maybe, and perhaps in summary, as I close my eyes, just to get some order. Just to consider that everybody is different, that we have collective opinions and thoughts and experiences. Everybody's different. So challenge yourself to seek what a specific individual might need or want. An easy form, if you are struggling for how to say, hey, I see you, might be just wanting to acknowledge what's going on in our current events and wanted to reach out and say hello. I think that really looking at our, just again, pride, I have to be right, make you wrong, or fear of certain things, or even just deception from stories that we hear. I think if we could challenge our limited beliefs around those and really champion the truth. And like you said, start with step one, which is to do your own work around biases and narratives and prejudices. And I think that's great. You did a great job.
Still doing it. Definitely not over yet. So long way to go yet, but taking at least the first few steps on that path, and we'll continue to do so. And don't see any end in sight, that's for sure.
So good.
So thank you again, Kim. We will stop our recording here, but again, just really appreciate you and for you being here.
Thanks, Jennifer.